We have now reached chapter 6 and halfway when we complete this lecture through the book of Daniel. Let's look at Darius the Mede. Critics have challenged Daniel's reference to the ascension of Darius the Mede that we saw back in chapter 5 and also here in chapter 6, verse 1, because there is no historical evidence outside of the Bible. Several explanations are possible, but perhaps this one is preferable. Darius was appointed by Cyrus to rule over Babylon, a comparatively small portion of the vast Medo-Persian Empire. According to Daniel 9:1, Darius was made to rule over the Babylonian kingdom. This suggests that he ruled by appointment rather than by conquest, and thus would have been subordinate to Cyrus, who appointed him. The historical situation leading to this appointment, based on the Nabonidus Chronicle, was that Babylon was conquered by Ugbaru, governor of Gudium, who entered the city of Babylon the night of Belshazzar's feast. After Ugbaru conquered Babylon on October the 12th, 539 BC, Cyrus entered the conquered city on October 29 of the same year. Ugbaru was then appointed by Cyrus to rule on his behalf in Babylon. 8 days of Cyrus's arrival, November 6, Ugbaru died. If Darius the Mede is another name of Ugbaru, as is entirely possible, the problem is solved. Since Darius was 62 years old when he took over Babylon, his death a few weeks later would not be unusual. Note, Gubaru is another spelling for Ugbaru, with the name Gobrias being a Greek form of the same name and appearing in Xenophon's Cryopedia. Now let's read verse 1. It seemed good to Darius to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, that they would be in charge of the whole kingdom, and over them 3 commissioners, of whom Daniel was one, that these satraps might be accountable to them, and that the king might not suffer loss. Then this Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners and satraps because he possessed an extraordinary spirit, and the king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. Let's look at the bullets. One of Darius's first responsibilities was to reorganize the newly conquered kingdom of Babylon. He appointed 120 satraps to rule over the kingdom of Babylon and put them under 3 administrators, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were responsible to the 3 administrators, perhaps 40 satraps to each administrator, so that the king was greatly aided in his administrative responsibilities. Daniel was an exceptional administrator, partly because of his extensive experience under Nebuchadnezzar for about 39 years. So the king planned to make Daniel responsible for the administration of the whole kingdom. This, of course, created friction between Daniel and the other administrators and 120 satraps. Verse 4 through 5. Then the commissioners and satraps began trying to find a ground of accusation against Daniel in regard to government affairs, but they could find no ground of accusation or evidence of corruption, inasmuch as he was faithful and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. Then these men said, "We will not find any ground of accusation against this Daniel unless we find it against him with regard to the law of his God." So let's look at the bullets here. The other 2 commissioners and 120 satraps sought some basis on which to accuse Daniel in his administrative work. They were probably jealous of his position and resented him because he was a Jew. But they found that Daniel was not corrupt. He was trustworthy and diligent in discharging his responsibilities. They decided that they would have to find some basis for accusation in his religious practices, which obviously were well known to them. Verses 6 through 9. Then these commissioners and satraps came by agreement to the king and spoke to him as follows. King Darius, live forever. All the commissioners of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the high officials and the governors, have consulted together that the king should establish a statute and enforce an injunction that anyone who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days shall be cast into the lion's den. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it may not be changed, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which may not be revoked. Therefore, King Darius signed the document, that is, the injunction. The bullets tells us the 122 leaders devised a plot. They suggested to King Darius that he, the king, be made the sole object of worship for 30 days. Either the 122 got others, prefects, advisors, and governors to agree to the plan, or the 122 merely said they all agreed. Saying they all agreed was wrong, for they certainly had not discussed this with Daniel. All prayer was to be addressed to the king in recognition of his power in the religious realm. The penalty for rebellion against his religious authority was to be death by being thrown to the lions. Darius, no doubt flattered by the adulation he would receive, consented to the plot and signed it into law, which, according to the Medo-Persian custom, was irrevocable. Verses 10 through 11. Now when Daniel knew that the document was signed, he entered his house. Now in his roof chamber, he had windows open toward Jerusalem, and he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God, as he had been doing previously. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and supplication before his God. The decree became public knowledge. But Daniel followed his customary practice of going to his own house to pray to his God 3 times each day. He prayed toward Jerusalem. His prayer was a prayer of thanksgiving as he acknowledged God's goodness to him. It also was a prayer for guidance and help. He sought God's wisdom in the decisions he had to make. Daniel was more than 80 years old at the time, 539 BC. So because of his age, he probably besought God for physical strength to carry on his heavy duties. Apparently, Daniel's opponents knew where and when he prayed, so they went to his room at the time and, as expected, found him praying. Verses 12 through 16. Then they approached and spoke before the king about the king's injunction. Did you not sign an injunction that any man who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days is to be cast into the lion's den? The king replied, the statement is true, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which may not be revoked. Then they answered and spoke before the king. Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or to the injunction which you signed, but keeps making his petition 3 times a day. Then as soon as the king heard this statement, he was deeply distressed and set his mind on delivering Daniel, and even until sunset he kept exerting himself to rescue him. Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, recognize, O king, that it is a law of the Medes and Persians that no injunction or statute which the king establishes may be changed. Then the king gave orders, and Daniel was brought in and cast into the lion's den. The king spoke and said to Daniel, your God, whom you constantly serve, will himself deliver you, Daniel. Let's look at the bullets. The accusation was soon made against Daniel by his opponents. King Darius found himself bound by his own law. Hearing their accusation against Daniel, Darius was greatly distressed. Though Darius knew he was bound by the law he made, he sought some way to rescue Daniel from the penalty. But finding it impossible to do so, he gave the order that Daniel be thrown into the lion's den. Verses 17 through 22. A stone was brought and laid over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring, with the signet rings of his nobles, so that nothing would be changed in regard to Daniel. Then the king went off to his palace and spent the night fasting, and no entertainment was brought before him, and his sleep fled from him. Then the king arose at dawn at the break of day and went in haste to the lion's den. When he had come near the den to Daniel, he cried out with a troubled voice. The king spoke and said to Daniel, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you constantly serve, been able to deliver you from the lions?" Then Daniel spoke to the king, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, inasmuch as I was found innocent before him, and also towards you, O king. I have committed no crime." Look at the bullets. A stone was placed over the mouth of the den, which was sealed with a royal seal. The king was deeply agitated that he had been tricked, so that night his sleep fled from him. At dawn, the king hurried to the lion's den. The king had hoped that Daniel might have been rescued by his God whom he served. Daniel replied that God had in fact kept him unharmed, since he was innocent before his God and toward the king. God's angel, Daniel said, had kept the lion's mouth shut. Verse 23 through 24. Then the king was very pleased and gave orders for Daniel to be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatever was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. Because he had trusted in his God. The king then gave orders, and they brought those men who had maliciously accused Daniel, and they cast them, their children, and their wives into the lions' den, and they had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. And look at the bullets. Discovering Daniel was still alive, Darius was overjoyed and had him lifted from the den. This experience illustrated for Darius the validity of faith in God and his power to control circumstances and deliver those who trust him. Then the king ordered that Daniel's accusers and their families be thrown into the den. The attempt by false accusation to exterminate the Jewish captive turned executive boomeranged. The accuser had persuaded Darius to put in effect a decree that was intended to eliminate Daniel, but ironically, they could not dissuade the king from eliminating them. I believe that finishes this lecture. No, it doesn't. I got one more. Chapter 6, verse 25. Then Darius the king wrote to all the peoples, nations, and men of every language who were living in all the land, "May your peace abound. I make a decree that in all the dominion of my kingdom, men are to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God and enduring forever. And his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed, and his dominion will be forever. He delivers and rescues and performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has also delivered Daniel from the power of the lions." So this Daniel enjoyed success in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. And let's look at the bullets as we finish. Darius, who had previously decreed himself to be revered for a month as God, now made a new decree that all subjects of his nation must fear and reverence Daniel's God. This was an amazing turnaround on Darius's part. The reason for this, Darius wrote, is that Daniel's God lives, whereas the gods of the Medes and Persians were dead idols. This God is eternal. His kingdom is indestructible, and he intervenes in people's affairs and delivers those who trust him. He works in miraculous power to perform his will. Such a God is truly to be reverenced and worshipped. In spite of the opposition to the satraps and administrators, Daniel was honored and lived during the reigns of Darius and Cyrus. And that should conclude